Well, hello, everybody. It's nice to be with you and to share this EcoPeace annual conference. So look, here's the situation. GDP has been slowing all over the world now for over 20 years. That's the reality. And the reason this is happening is productivity has been declining all over the world for the last 20 years. And the result is we have a lot of structural unemployment everywhere. Especially for the millennial and Gen Z generation, they're having a difficult time finding a secure place in a 21st century workforce. Our economists are telling us 20 more years of low productivity and slow growth. It's clear we have an economic problem, but now it's compounded by a far more aggressive issue. We're in real-time climate change, and our scientists are telling us we're in the sixth extinction of life on Earth. It doesn't even make the headlines. It's the most important story we've ever faced in the 200,000 years our species have been on this planet. And I want all the parents here to listen to this. Our scientists are telling us that we're likely to lose over half the species that inhabit this planet in the next 8 decades. That's the time period of today's young toddlers and babies. The last time we had an extinction event of this magnitude was 65 million years ago. We are asleep. We're talking about the next 8 decades. And the UN panel on climate change, our scientists tell us we've got now 10 years left, 10, to completely transform the economic model in our social paradigm. And we've got probably 20 years ahead of us where we have to actually get to a zero emission society. That's one generation. So what do? We need a new economic vision for the Middle East and the world. It needs to be compelling. It needs to be administered quickly in the developing world and the industrial world. We have to be off a carbon-based civilization in 2 decades. So we need to come back and look at how the great economic paradigm shifts in history occur. If we know how they occur, we'll get a roadmap here in Jordan and Palestine and Israel and the rest of the world, and we'll get a compass to navigate a new journey. There have been at least 7 really primary economic paradigm shifts in history, and they're very interesting from an anthropological point of view. They all share a common denominator, and that is at a moment of time across a society, the 3 defining technologies emerge and converge to create an infrastructure that fundamentally transforms the way society communicates, powers, and moves its economic activity, its social life, and governance. And here's what those 3 technology revolutions are. Number 1, new communication revolutions. Number 2, new energy revolutions. Number 3, new mobility and logistics revolutions. When new communication technologies converge with new sources of energy and new modes of mobility and logistics, it fundamentally changes the way a society communicates, powers, and moves economic and social life. It changes the business models, it changes governance, it changes the temporal spatial orientation of society, it changes our built environment, it changes our worldview. I'm going to give you 2 quick examples. So this isn't esoteric. 19th century Britain, first industrial revolution. The communication revolution was steam power printing and the telegraph. These 2 communication technologies allowed us to bring larger numbers of people together in more complex arrangements to communicate over time and space. Then the Brits laid out a new energy regime, coal, harvested in the hinterlands of the British Isles. And then they put the steam engine on rails for locomotives and national transport. So these 3 technology revolutions, communication, energy, mobility, and logistics, they changed our built environment. We went to dense urban environments with locomotive traffic. We went to national markets and nation states. Second industrial revolution, the United States in the 20th century, another convergence, communication, energy, mobility, and logistics. The telephone. This was a really big deal. I know the young people think the internet is amazing, but imagine after 200,000 years, people talking into a little mechanical device and taking that across electrical signals and someone else listening and responding. So telephone in the United States and later radio and television became the communication revolution, and it converged with a new energy regime, cheap Texas oil. And then Henry Ford put everybody in the internal combustion engine, automobiles, and then container ships, jet travel, everything went from there. The second industrial revolution took the entire world through the 20th century. It's now ending. We are seeing the very convulsive endgame of an industrial civilization based on fossil fuels, internal combustion transport, and traditional analog communication. So this begs the question, where do we go from here? It's clear we need a new economic plan. I'm going to share an anecdote. I advised the European Union and have advised the last 4 presidents of the EU, and more recently, over the last 8 years, the leadership of the People's Republic of China. And in that context, I want to share an anecdote. When Chancellor Merkel became Chancellor of Germany, she asked me to come to Berlin in the first couple of weeks of her new government to address the question, how do we move the German economy and create jobs on her watch? And the very first question I asked the Chancellor when I arrived in Berlin, I said, Madam Chancellor, how do you move Germany forward when your businesses are plugged into a second industrial revolution infrastructure of centralized telecommunication, fossil fuel, nuclear power, internal combustion road, rail, water, and air transport, and that infrastructure to communicate, power, and move your economic life and social life, it peaked in its aggregate efficiency in Germany and virtually every other industrial country over the past decade. So I said, you can have market reform and labor reform and fiscal reform and try to stimulate some startups, but as long as they're plugged into a dying second industrial revolution infrastructure, you're not going to move forward. So on that first day, we talked about a third industrial revolution, a digital revolution that was just now emerging in Europe. And at the end of the day, the chancellor said, we're going to have this third industrial revolution, this digital infrastructure revolution for the European Union, hopefully the world. Here's what it is. The communication revolution is the internet. We have 4.5 billion people connected on the World Wide Web. Pretty soon the whole human race at very low fixed and marginal costs with cheap smartphones. And those smartphones have more computing power than sent our astronauts to the moon. Everyone's connected. Now this digitized communication internet is just now converging in Europe, China, and a couple of states in the US with a digitized electricity internet. So that we now have millions of sites, homeowners, local businesses, small communities, farm associations, even large companies who are generating their own solar and wind electricity where they live, where they work, in their communities. And what they're not using, they're sharing the surplus green electricity back on a electricity internet so that it can be shared by others across regions, continents, and within the next 10 years, it'll be across oceans. And the sharing of electricity will depend on using the same data, the same analytics, the same algorithms to share solar and wind electricity among millions of people, as we now use data, analytics, and algorithms to share news, knowledge, and entertainment on the ICT communication internet. They're one internet now. Communication internet, electricity internet converge. The two internets are now converging with a third internet, a digitized mobility and logistics internet made up of electric and fuel cell vehicles powered by solar and wind from the electricity internet. And over the next decade, those vehicles will increasingly be autonomous, no drivers, and they'll be managed by the same big data and analytics we use to manage and share electricity on the electricity internet and to share news, knowledge, and entertainment on the communication internet. These three internets are a third industrial revolution infrastructure for a transformation of the economy in a zero carbon era. They ride on top of a platform called the Internet of Things. We're putting sensors across all of our building stock. We have sensors in the agricultural fields monitoring the growth of our crops, sensors in the factory floor monitoring production, sensors in smart homes and smart vehicles and smart road systems and warehouses. They're creating data. And that data increasingly will be fed back to local communication internet, the electricity internet, the mobility internet, to communicate power and move economic and social life in local neighborhoods and communities. The Internet of Things is lodged in the building stock. Every building in Palestine and Jordan and Israel needs to be retrofitted for climate resilience. This is not the age of progress. We're in the age of resilience. Every building has to be retrofitted to deal with floods, droughts, wildfires. And then every building needs to be transformed into a node, N-O-D-E, with its own edge data center. So it can blockchain its own distributed, if you will, means of communicating and not rely on big global centralized data centers and companies. Every building becomes a micro power generation site with solar and wind nearby, if you can. Every building becomes a generator of storage energy with hydrogen storage and batteries. Every building becomes a micro site to power your electric vehicle. And the buildings connect up, the Internet of Things. They connect with each other. It's a distributed system. And what's best about this system is that it's distributed, not centralized. You know, the first and second industrial revolution infrastructures were designed, engineer-wise, to be centralized, top-down, enmeshed in intellectual property protection, and they vertically integrated to create economies of scale. So you ended up with a handful of giant corporations, Fortune 500, managing much of the business of the world. And of course, this is largely responsible for a lot of the inequality that we find in our economic system. The third industrial revolution infrastructure, by contrast, is actually engineered to be distributed. It works best if it's open and transparent, not enclosed intellectual property. Every person under 40 who's a digital native knows the network effect. The more people in the network, the more everyone benefits from the network. There's no win-lose, it's a win-win. And a third industrial revolution infrastructure wants to be laterally scaled. So everything I've just told you is starting to scale in various communities. It's taking us, what we're really doing is creating a global brain and nervous system. The brain is Galileo and GPS, we all use it. The nervous system is sensors across the planet. And it takes us into bringing the human race together, but it's a distributed form. And that is, I think we're going to see a shift toward glocalization. First industrial revolution gave us national markets. The second gave us globalization. The third industrial revolution, 3.0, gives us glocalization. Because the technology is so cheap, and it's going to belong to everyone. This isn't centralized infrastructure. Anyone that owns, if you will, an electric vehicle that can send power back to the grid is part of the infrastructure. Anyone that has solar on the roof or wind nearby, they're part of the infrastructure. Anybody that's sharing data on an edge data center, they're part of the infrastructure. And what this distributor infrastructure means is you will be able, everyone across these three countries, to have your own solar and wind when possible. And you'll be able to be on a centralized grid and actually move off the grid. If there's a climate event or a cyber terrorist attack, you have microgrids. Every neighborhood will have microgrids. We're looking at 78 million microgrids for the United States so that you can go off the main grid of electricity at a moment's notice if there's a climate event or cyber terrorist attack, and you can generate your own electricity, solar and wind regionally and locally. So it makes the system immune to centralized power grabs. The interesting thing about it is it's doable now. Last year, something happened that everyone in the Middle East needs to know about. Last year, the levelized cost of solar and wind dipped very low. And the levelized cost of solar is now below the cost of natural gas, oil, coal, and nuclear, way below. Three of them, and now just below natural gas. And the fixed cost is plummeting, and the marginal cost of solar and wind is near zero. In Europe and China, where I work, the sun and the wind don't send a bill. They're free. Coal, oil, gas, and uranium are not free. They're extremely expensive to locate, extract, and refine and recycle. So we have an opportunity here. And what I would say is your three countries are looking at the nexus of water and energy. They are a nexus. You need electricity to actually generate and move water through the pipes. Without electricity, you can't move water through the pipes. And you need water in order to establish electricity, especially with hydrogen. If you are using wind off the coast or using solar and you want to store it, you have to have clean water, not salt water, but clean water that can electrolyze that sun and that wind and store it and then send it as electricity across the grid. So there's an opportunity here, I think, for these three countries to be a bellwether and first mover to show the Middle East what's possible when three countries can come together in EcoPeace and establish a localized approach to power and also a bioregional approach to governance. I am convinced that we are going to see more bioregional governance based on the anatomy of local ecosystems. Because when you're in a local ecosystem or biome, you share the same opportunities that ecosystem provisions and the same restraints when there's a problem, especially with climate events. So I would like to see a region in the Middle East, Jordan and Israel and Palestine, be the first to create a bioregional approach to governance. This means you need to have an electricity transmission line that connects all three countries. You need to be able to take that salt water and desalinize it so that you have fresh water, so that you can use that to electrolyze your solar and wind with hydrogen and have a stored source of electricity across the three regions for farming, agriculture, local business, and mobility and logistics. Is this possible? Everything I've just said to you is being scaled somewhere, but not fast enough. We need first movers, and this requires a transformation in worldview. Last thought. I'm only guardedly hopeful we can make this shift in time to avoid a catastrophic climate extinction event. The reason I'm guardedly hopeful is young people around the world in the last 2 years went out on strike from their high schools. They walked out of the classrooms in 141 countries, and they called for a global climate emergency and a Green New Deal. And this is a very different protest. We've had a lot of protests over history. This one's different. We've had protests that have always been based on specific interests. But here, this was the first time two generations, millennial and Gen Zs, saw themselves as a species. They came out in the streets, millions of them, as a species, bypassing all the boundaries and borders that have kept us from each other. And they said, we are an imperial species, and they began to see their fellow creatures as part of their evolutionary family. And the biosphere is their indivisible community in which we're all embedded and beholden. That's a change in consciousness. Hopefully it can start in the Middle East. Hopefully it can start in Jordan and Israel and Palestine, a biosphere consciousness, a species realization. The last reason I'm guardedly hopeful, my country went through the entire first industrial revolution, 30 years, from 1870 to 1900, laid out continental rail system, telegraph system, seeded public land for cities, set up universities. We set off the second industrial revolution in 25 years, from 1908 to the Depression, electrified the cities, manufactured millions of vehicles, put in the road systems, the pipelines, et cetera. We now have cheap enough technology so that even developing countries have technology cheap enough so that you can begin this task. So it isn't a matter of the cost of the technology or R&D. It's here, it's cheap. It's below the price of fossil fuels and nuclear. The only question is political will. We need a new generation in the Middle East and America and everywhere else who understands the gravity of this situation, the need to create a completely new economic paradigm that will allow communities around the world in a globalized planet to be more self-sufficient, to be more resilient, and to be first movers to protect the biosphere of the earth in which we live. I'm hoping that this EcoPeace conference will mark the beginning of the next part of your journey, which is to show the Middle East and the entire world what three small countries can do to create a new paradigm for generations yet to come. Thank you for giving me this time with you. I really appreciate it.